All right, let's dive in. Today we're exploring Wi-Fi passphrase security.
Hmm.
We're looking at a research paper from Singapore. It analyzes how people choose their passphrases out in the wild, in the real world, and it reveals some pretty interesting stuff about the vulnerabilities that come with those choices. I mean, I'm sure you already know that strong passwords are, well, they're essential, right? But this research, this really digs deep into the specifics, like how people actually make those passphrases and then how those choices, how they can be exploited.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this research is that it doesn't just stick to, the technical details of those Wi-Fi security protocols like WPA2 and WPA3. It actually looks at the human side of things, which we
Hmm.
know is often the weakest link in any security system.
For sure, for sure. So let's get into some of those vulnerabilities. I mean, even with something as strong as WPA2 encryption, there have been cracks like the KRACK and more recently that PMKID attack.
Right, the KIACK attack, yeah, it's serious, but it needs some specific conditions to really work. But that PMKID attack, that one's particularly worrisome because it's so accessible. It's a clientless attack, so the attacker doesn't even have to be connected to your network to pull it off.
So for our listeners who might not be familiar, can you break down how this PMKID attack actually works? What makes it so effective?
Well, it takes advantage of a specific kind of frame. It's called the RSNIE. And this frame, it contains the PMKID hash. Now, this hash, it's essentially a unique digital fingerprint that's derived from your Wi-Fi passphrase, and the attacker can actually capture it.
Okay, so the attacker gets this PMKID hash. Then what? What do they do with it?
Well, they try to crack it. It's a brute force kind of thing, trying a bunch of different passphrase combinations until they find one that creates the same hash.
Hmm.
And this is where the research paper gets, well, a little scary. The researchers were able to crack a surprising number of the PMKID hashes they collected, which means a lot of people are choosing really weak passphrases.
Which leads us to the heart of this deep dive, really. What kinds of passphrases are people using out there, and how are those choices making them vulnerable?
Right, so the study categorized the passphrases that they cracked. And the most common type, phone-based. Almost 45% of people are just using their phone numbers as their Wi-Fi passphrase.
It might seem like, a huge set of numbers to try and guess, but phone numbers, they often follow pretty predictable patterns, right?
Exactly. You've got area codes, prefixes, and even the starting digits for phone numbers in certain regions. All of that significantly reduces the number of combinations an attacker has to actually try.
So if an attacker knows, say, your general location, they might already have a pretty good head start on guessing your phone number-based passphrase.
Exactly. Another big category was user-defined passphrases, which accounted for about 27% of the cracked ones. These are usually pretty simple, like alphanumeric combinations, the kind that are, unfortunately, very vulnerable to dictionary attacks.
Like password 123 or QWERTY.
Yeah.
Those are classics for a reason, right?
Yeah, sadly. And speaking of classics, about 15% of the cracked passphrases were, well, straight from a dictionary, like pulled directly from lists like RockU. It's basically like using a precompiled list of the most common passwords, which are readily available to attackers.
It's like leaving your front door wide open and putting out a welcome mat for them.
Pretty much. We also saw a good chunk, about 7%, that were just default passphrases, the ones that come preset on the writers.
Yeah.
I mean, manufacturers usually tell you to change those, but a lot of people just don't, which leaves their networks wide open.
The researchers even found one manufacturer using the same default passphrase for both WPA-PSK and their WPS-PIN, which is not great.
Yeah, that's a major security oversight. WPS, Wi-Fi protected setup, was meant to make connecting devices easier, but it has some known vulnerabilities, and using the same weak passphrase for both just, well, makes the problem even worse.
Right? Dates of significance, like birthdays or anniversaries, those also popped up. About 4% of the cracked pass voices, which I guess shows how much we love to use personally meaningful stuff. But that also makes it easy to guess.
Yeah, it's a classic trade-off. And then, believe it or not, they even found people using their NRIC numbers as passphrases. That's the Singaporean equivalent of a social security number. I mean, they seem random, but the way those identification numbers are structured with their checksum calculations and all that, well, attackers who know the system can actually exploit that.
So we've seen a whole bunch of weak passphrase choices, but what I find really fascinating is this idea that even passphrases that look strong on the surface can be vulnerable, all because of, well, us and our predictable human behavior. That's where entropy comes in, right?
Yeah, entropy. So entropy, when we talk about passphrases, it's basically a measure of how random or unpredictable something is. The higher the entropy, the tougher it is to guess.
So I'm guessing that means a longer passphrase with, like, a mix of different characters would usually have higher entropy than...
Yeah, you got it. But this research, it goes deeper than that. It digs into this fascinating aspect of entropy that most people don't even think about: human behavior.
human behavior. How does that play into entropy? I'm curious.
Well, when you calculate entropy, you usually focus on stuff like the length of the passphrase and how many different characters it uses. But what it doesn't always account for are the predictable patterns that we humans tend to follow, when we're making and typing those passphrases.
So you could have a passphrase that looks really random on paper, but it's still vulnerable because of, well, because of human predictability.
Oh, you got it. You got it. The research actually introduces this concept called the vector space model to show what I mean. They map passphrase entry onto what they call a keyboard matrix. It's basically like a 3D representation of your keyboard where each key is a point in this matrix.
Okay, so I'm picturing this keyboard matrix.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're typing your passphrase, you're basically tracing a path through this 3D space.
Exactly. And it's that path, the sequence of keystrokes, that can reveal vulnerabilities, even if the passphrase itself seems totally random.
So can you give us an example of how that would work in the real world?
Sure. Imagine a passphrase that's got uppercase, lowercase, numbers, symbols, the whole shebang. Based on the characters, it might have a really high entropy score. But what if the person typed it in by just moving their fingers in order across the keyboard, like left to right along the top row, for example? That pattern, even though the characters are random, that pattern can be exploited.
So even though the characters themselves are mixed up, it's the way they're entered that creates this predictable pattern.
Exactly. And that's why this research argues that just looking at entropy isn't enough. You got to consider the human element, how people actually type and the patterns that come from that.
It really shows how relying just on password generators or complexity requirements can fall short.
Absolutely. You could tick all the boxes for complexity, but if it follows a predictable pattern on the keyboard, well, you're still vulnerable.
So this paper also goes into some specific vulnerabilities that were found in routers from one particular manufacturer, TP-Link. What did they find there?
Yeah, with TP-Link, the researchers found a couple of security oversights. First, they found that some of their models use the same 8-digit default passphrase for both WPA-PSK and the WPS-PIN. Remember, we talked about that.
Right, making one weak point that affects both the main Wi-Fi access and that WPS setmark.
Exactly. They also discovered that TP-Link was using the last 4 hexadecimal characters of the router's MSC address as the default passphrase to connect to the router itself.
So if someone could get their hands on the router's MC address, they could just waltz right in.
That's the worry, yeah. MIC addresses aren't usually broadcast over the network, but there are ways to sniff them out.
And to make things even worse, they found that TP-Link actually limited the maximum length of the WPA2 passphrase to just 14 characters, even though the IE standard allows up to 63.
Yeah, that arbitrary limit that TP-Link put in place, it really shrinks the potential entropy of the passphrase, which weakens security, obviously.
It really goes to show that you can't just blindly trust manufacturers to have your back when it comes to security.
You got to be proactive, you got to be informed about the devices you're using and the potential vulnerabilities they might have.
So given everything we've talked about,
Yeah.
What can our listeners do to, boost their Wi-Fi security?
The first thing, and this is huge, choose strong and unique passphrases for your Wi-Fi network. And stay away from all those patterns we talked about. Phone numbers, simple combos, dictionary words, defaults, anything personally identifiable.
And using a passphrase generator is always a good idea, right? To get those truly random, high-entropy passphrases.
Definitely. They can be really handy. And like we talked about, be mindful of how you actually type those passphrases in. Don't fall into those predictable patterns on the keyboard.
So besides choosing a good passphrase,
Yeah.
What else can people do to make their Wi-Fi more secure?
Enabling a strong firewall on your router is crucial. It's like a barrier between your network and the outside world, blocks unauthorized access and all that malicious traffic. Think of it as a security checkpoint for your network.
Yeah, it seems pretty basic, but I bet a lot of people don't even think about it.
You're right. A lot of routers come with built-in firewalls, but you got to make sure they're turned on and configured properly,
Okay, and what about WPS? We talked about how vulnerable it can be.
If you're not using it actively, like for easy device connections, just disable it. The convenience just isn't worth the security risk.
Speaking of risks, what about all those IoT devices, smart bulbs and cameras and stuff?
Right, all that Internet of Things stuff. Network segmentation can help with that. It means dividing your network into smaller, isolated subnets. Like you could have a separate subnet just for your IoT devices, keep them away from your main network.
So if one of those devices gets hacked, the attacker can't get to, like, my computer or anything important.
Exactly. It contains the damage and limits the impact of an attack. Kind of like setting up security zones within your network.
This research has really opened my eyes to all the things we don't usually think about when it comes to Wi-Fi security.
For sure, people get caught up in how strong their encryption is, but they forget about how predictable we humans are and those little configuration choices that can make a big difference.
So if we had to, like, sum up the key takeaways from this deep dive, what would you say they are?
Well, the biggest thing is realizing that Wi-Fi security isn't just one thing. It's not just about a strong passphrase. It's about layering multiple security measures, to build a solid defense for your network.
So strong passphrases, firewalls, disabling WPS, segmenting the network. It's all about creating this web of protection.
Exactly. And just as important is being proactive and staying informed. Keep up with the latest threats and vulnerabilities, and don't just assume that manufacturers are putting security first.
Do your own research, understand your devices,
Yeah,
and make sure you set them up with security in mind.
definitely. And never underestimate common sense. If something online seems too good to be true, it probably is. Be careful with those suspicious emails and links, and never share your Wi-Fi passphrase or any personal info unless you're absolutely sure it's safe.
Great advice. This deep dive has been really insightful, showing us how complex Wi-Fi security can be. We've learned about the technical side and how much our own behavior plays a role.
Yeah, it's been fun exploring this with you.
And to all our listeners, we hope this has been helpful and empowering. Remember, cybersecurity is an ongoing process. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe out there in the digital world.
And never stop learning. The world of cybersecurity is constantly changing, so staying informed is your best defense.
Well said. And on that note, this concludes our deep dive into Wi-Fi passphrase security. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.